Picture this. It's 1865, and you're standing on the Texas plains under a sun so merciless it seems to have a personal vendetta against every living thing beneath it. The Civil War has just ended, and America is trying to figure out what the hell it's supposed to be now. But out here, on this endless expanse of grass and dust, a different kind of war is about to begin. Charles Goodnight stands in his stirrups, surveying his herd of longhorn cattle stretching toward the horizon like a living, breathing river of potential wealth. His face bears the permanent marks of Comanche arrows and 4 brutal years as a Texas Ranger, fighting Indians in a landscape that seemed designed specifically to kill white men. But right now, watching another one of his cowboys collapse from exhaustion just 50 miles into what should be a 1,000-mile journey, Goodnight is fighting an enemy more insidious than any warrior's lance. He's fighting starvation in the middle of abundance. Think about the cruel mathematics here. A longhorn steer worth $4 in Texas could bring $40 in the hungry northern markets. $40. That's more than most men made in 2 months. A single successful cattle drive could net $30,000 in profit. Enough money to buy a small town. But here's the catch that would make the devil himself laugh. You had to get those cattle to market alive, and more importantly, you had to keep your cowboys alive long enough to deliver them. The statistics were as brutal as a kick from an angry Mustang. Cattle drive operators routinely lost 30% of their cowboys to desertion, disease, and death. Each trained hand represented a $100 investment. A man who knew how to read cattle behavior, who could sleep in the saddle, who wouldn't panic when 2,000 longhorns decided to stampede toward Mexico in the middle of the night. Lose 3 out of 10 of these men, and your profit margins disappeared faster than water in this God-forsaken heat. And what was killing them? Not Indian raids, though those happened. Not stampedes, though those were terrifying. Not even rattlesnakes or flash floods, though Texas seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of both. No, the cowboys were dying from something far more mundane and infinitely more tragic. They were dying from bad food. Imagine the irony. These men were surrounded by 2,000 head of prime beef on the hoof, walking steaks that could feed an army. But they were slowly starving on rancid bacon and weevil-infested hardtack carried in filthy saddlebags that had seen everything from river crossings to dust storms. The bacon was so old it had turned green. The hardtack was so full of weevils it practically walked away on its own. And the coffee, well, calling it coffee was an insult to coffee everywhere. The chuck wagon hadn't been invented yet, so each cowboy carried his own provisions in whatever container he could find. Picture a former Confederate soldier, maybe a boy who'd seen Gettysburg, now trying to make a meal from supplies that had been bouncing around in a canvas bag for weeks. No refrigeration, obviously. No way to keep anything clean. No protection from the elements. When it rained, everything turned to mush. When it was dry, everything turned to dust. Former slaves seeking freedom in the saddle, Mexican vaqueros with generations of cattle wisdom encoded in their bones, green teenagers from eastern cities who thought cowboying would be romantic, they all shared the same miserable fate. Months of monotonous, spoiled food that broke spirits faster than the hardest bronco ever broke bones. But Charles Goodnight was watching all this with the eye of a man who'd learned something during his years fighting Indians and studying military tactics. He'd seen how armies moved, how they supplied themselves, how the difference between victory and defeat often came down to something as simple as keeping soldiers fed and healthy. The moment of revelation came during a torrential downpour on the Pecos River. Picture this scene. It's midnight, lightning is splitting the sky like God's own artillery barrage, and the rain is coming down so hard it sounds like bullets hitting the ground. Goodnight is watching his cook, an old army veteran who'd probably forgotten more about hardship than most men ever learned, struggling to prepare something resembling a meal while everything, and I mean everything, dissolves in the mud. The flour turns to paste, the matches won't light. The medicine that could save a man's life from snakebite or dysentery is washing away into the darkness. Cowboys are falling ill from contaminated water and spoiled meat, and there's not a damn thing anyone can do about it because the entire food system is fundamentally broken. That's when it hit him. The solution wasn't just about food, it was about mobile civilization itself. What if you could take everything a kitchen represented, organization, cleanliness, proper storage, reliable cooking methods, and make it mobile? What if you could create a traveling fortress of sustenance that could withstand stampedes, storms, and Indian raids while keeping 30 men fed and healthy across 1,000 miles of hostile territory? Standing in that downpour, watching good men suffer needlessly, Charles Goodnight began to envision something that would revolutionize not just cattle drives, but the entire American frontier. He was imagining the chuck wagon, though he didn't know it yet. He was imagining a simple innovation that would feed millions, create legends, and ultimately help build the American West. But first, he had to figure out how to build the damn thing. And that's where our story really begins, because what Charles Goodnight was about to create wouldn't just change cattle driving, it would change America itself. The question was, could he build it before he lost his entire crew, to the slow, grinding death of bad food and broken spirits? In the spring of 1866, Charles Goodnight's ranch hands gathered around what looked like the bastard child of a farm wagon and a medieval siege engine. They scratched their heads, spat tobacco juice, and wondered if their boss had finally lost his mind to the Texas heat. What they were looking at was Goodnight's answer to the problem that had been killing cowboys faster than Comanche war parties: a modified Studebaker wagon that would either revolutionize the cattle industry or become the most expensive pile of kindling on the frontier. The innovation seemed almost laughably simple, which is exactly what makes it genius. Goodnight had taken an ordinary farm wagon, the kind you could buy in any frontier town for $60, and bolted a sloped wooden box to its rear end. But this wasn't just any box. This thing was compartmentalized like a naval warship, with dozens of individual spaces for sourdough starter, Arbuckle's coffee, flour, beans, and medicines. Each compartment had its own lid, keeping everything separate, organized, and protected from the chaos of trail life. The real stroke of brilliance was the hinged door that dropped down from the back of the box to become a work table. Picture this. You're 100 miles from nowhere, it's darker than the inside of a coffin, and you need to prepare a meal for 30 hungry, irritable men who've been eating dust all day. With Goodnight's design, you simply lower that door, and suddenly you have a clean, organized workspace with everything you need within arm's reach. It was like having a kitchen that could pack up and move at a moment's notice. But Goodnight wasn't done. Beneath the wagon, he'd slung a cowhide contraption the cowboys dubbed the possum belly, a leather hammock that carried kindling and kept it dry even through river crossings. Water barrels hung from the sides like armor plating, ensuring clean drinking water between streams. The whole contraption looked like it was ready for war, which, in a sense, it was. The maiden voyage on what would become known as the Goodnight Loving Trail, named after Goodnight and his partner Oliver Loving, became the stuff of frontier legend almost immediately. The cook they hired was a character straight out of a dime novel, Dirty Dave Rudabore, a failed gunfighter who'd discovered his true calling wasn't with a six-shooter but with a coffee pot and a sourdough starter. Dave took to that chuck wagon like a duck to water, or maybe more accurately, like a preacher to salvation. He organized those compartments with military precision, labeled everything in his barely legible scrawl, and established rules that would have made a cavalry sergeant proud. Nobody, and I mean nobody, touched his sourdough starter without permission. That living culture of wild yeast became more sacred than a Sunday sermon, because Dave knew that fresh bread could mean the difference between a crew that worked hard and a crew that mutinied somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The first real test came near Fort Sumner, when Apache raiders decided to see what all the fuss was about. Picture this scene. It's dawn. The mist is rising off the Pecos River, and suddenly the morning quiet explodes with war whoops and rifle fire. Most of the cowboys scattered for cover, but not Dirty Dave. He grabbed a shotgun in one hand, a coffee pot in the other, and declared to anyone within shouting distance that any man who threatened his sourdough starter would meet his maker before breakfast. The Apaches, perhaps recognizing a fellow warrior when they saw one, decided to find easier targets. Dave's coffee never stopped brewing, but the real test wasn't Indian raids, it was the Pecos crossing itself. Anyone who's ever tried to get a loaded wagon across a flooding river knows it's like trying to thread a needle while riding a bucking bronco. The water was running high and fast, carrying enough debris to stock a lumber yard. Lesser men would have waited for conditions to improve, but cattle drives operated on schedules tighter than a miser's purse strings. Dave lashed himself to his chuck box like Captain Ahab to his white whale, determined to save the medical supplies that could prevent scurvy and treat snake bites. When the wagon hit a submerged boulder and nearly overturned, Dave hung on with the tenacity of a man defending his life's work, because in a very real sense, that's exactly what he was doing. That wagon represented something bigger than just a mobile kitchen. It was a piece of civilization rolling across the wilderness. Within months, word of Goodnight's innovation spread across the frontier faster than a grass fire in August. The chuck wagon proved its worth not just in convenience, but in cold, hard cash and warm, red blood. During a cholera outbreak near the Colorado border, the segregated medicine chest saved 18 lives with laudanum and castor oil, while the clean water barrels prevented the kind of contamination that could wipe out an entire crew. Oliver Loving himself credited the wagon with enabling their record-breaking drive of 18 days from Texas to Colorado. Well-fed cowboys could push the herd through 18-hour days without collapsing from malnutrition. They arrived at market with cattle in prime condition and crews intact, a combination that translated directly into profit margins that made other outfits weep with envy. Competing cattle operations scrambled to copy Goodnight's design, like students cheating off the smart kids' exam paper. But here's what they didn't understand initially. The true innovation wasn't just the wagon itself. It was the entire system, the organization, the sacred rules of operation, the transformation of eating from individual survival into communal ritual. The chuck wagon was becoming something more than a tool. It was becoming the beating heart of American expansion, pumping sustenance and civilization into the wild frontier. And this was just the beginning. Because what started as one man's solution to a practical problem was about to become the foundation of an empire that would stretch from Texas to Montana, feeding thousands and creating legends that would outlast the men who lived them. The revolution was rolling, and nothing would ever be the same. By 1875, the American West had been transformed into something that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier, a vast network of mobile communities connected by dust trails and the aroma of coffee brewing over open fires. Over 3,000 chuck wagons rolled across the Western territories, each one a mobile embassy of emerging American culture, where former enemies broke bread as brothers under stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. The numbers alone tell a story that reads like a fever dream of American capitalism. The XIT Ranch. And when I say ranch, I mean an operation that covered more territory than some eastern states. Operated 150 wagons across 3 million acres of Texas rangeland. 3 million acres. That's larger than Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. Richard King's chuck wagon network in South Texas generated $2 million annually just by keeping cowboys healthy enough to work year-round. $2 million in 1870s money, we're talking about the equivalent of $50 million today. But these wagons carried more than food and medicine. They transported something far more precious and infinitely more dangerous: democracy itself. Because around that chuck wagon, during what the cowboys called the Sacred Supper Circle, something magical happened that the Founding Fathers probably never imagined when they wrote about equality. Mexican vaqueros, with generations of cattle wisdom encoded in their DNA, sat next to African American cowboys seeking freedom in the saddle, who shared beans and stories with white trail bosses whose grandfathers might have owned slaves. German immigrants fleeing European wars passed sourdough biscuits to Irish boys running from potato famines, while Chinese cooks who'd survived building the Transcontinental Railroad served up fusion cuisine that was creating American food culture in real time. This wasn't some idealistic dream of brotherhood. This was pure practical necessity elevated to the level of sacrament. When you're 1,000 miles from civilization and a grizzly bear could eat your face off while you're taking a morning constitutional, you don't much care about the color of the man watching your back. The chuck wagon became the one place where America's promise of equality actually worked, because survival has a way of making philosophers out of simple men. The cooks who commanded these rolling kingdoms became frontier celebrities whose reputations preceded them like the dust clouds of approaching herds. None was more famous than Black Sam Washington, whose sourdough starter had begun life in 1867 and traveled over 10,000 miles across 7 states and 2 territories. That starter contained wild yeast captured from everywhere: Kansas wheat fields, Colorado mountain air, New Mexico desert winds. It was like a living, breathing map of American expansion, bubbling away in Sam's carefully tended crock. Sam's coffee became the stuff of legend. Cowboys claimed it was thick enough to float a horseshoe and strong enough to wake the dead. Men rode 50 miles out of their way just for a cup, arriving at his chuck wagon like pilgrims to a shrine. His Sunday-spotted pup rice pudding with raisins became so renowned that hardened men who'd killed other men with their bare hands would weep openly at the taste, overwhelmed by memories of mothers and homes they'd left behind in pursuit of fortune and freedom. But the ultimate chuck, the wagon legend, belonged to One-Eyed Pete Morrison, whose encounter with a massive grizzly bear near the Yellowstone elevated him to the pantheon of frontier immortals. Picture this scene. It's early morning. The mist is rising off the river, and Pete is preparing breakfast when he hears a sound like a locomotive crashing through timber. He turns around to find himself face to face with a grizzly that probably weighed 800 pounds and had an attitude problem the size of Montana. Most men would have run screaming. Pete grabbed the nearest weapon available, a cast-iron skillet that weighed about 12 pounds, and proceeded to beat that bear senseless with nothing but pure cantankerous will and a lifetime of dealing with ornery cowboys. The fight lasted 20 minutes and left both Pete and the bear exhausted. But the bear decided to find easier breakfast arrangements elsewhere. Pete served flapjacks 30 minutes later, using the same skillet. The cultural fusion happening around these wagons was creating American cuisine faster than food historians could catalogue it. Mexican vaqueros introduced chilies and tortillas that transformed bland Anglo cooking into something worth eating. African-American cooks contributed cornbread techniques and greens preparation that added nutrition and flavor to meals that had previously been exercises in survival. German immigrants brought sauerkraut and sausage-making skills that helped preserve meat on long drives. Chinese cooks on the northern routes introduced stir-frying techniques using those same cast-iron skillets, creating dishes that existed nowhere else on Earth. The chuck wagon became everything a frontier community needed rolled into one mobile unit. It was a rolling courthouse where disputes were settled by cooks whose word was law. It was a chapel where cowboys were married under star-filled skies and buried when luck ran out. It was a library where precious books and month-old newspapers connected the frontier to civilization, read aloud by firelight to men who couldn't read themselves, but hungered for news from the world they'd left behind. During the Great Die-Up winter of 1886, when temperatures plunged to 40 below zero and cattle froze standing upright like ice sculptures, chuck wagons became arks of survival. Cooks burned everything from wagon wheels to furniture to keep their fires alive and their cowboys from freezing to death. That winter killed 85% of the cattle on the northern plains, but the crews that clustered around chuck wagons had survival rates 3 times higher than those without. The wagon had become more than a tool or even a symbol. It had become the beating heart of American expansion, pumping life into a landscape that seemed designed to kill everything that moved across it. Every morning, when the coffee pot started bubbling and the smell of bacon began wafting across the prairie, civilization reasserted itself in the wilderness. But even as the chuck wagon reached the height of its influence, forces were gathering that would challenge its dominance. Barbed wire was beginning to carve up the open range. Railroads were pushing deeper into cattle country. The age of the great drives was approaching its end, and with it, the golden era of the rolling kitchen that had fed a nation's expansion. The question was, what would happen to all that accumulated wisdom, all those traditions, all that community spirit when the trails finally closed forever? The autumn of 1893 brought something that seasoned cowboys thought they'd never see. The last great cattle drive from Texas to Montana. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of ending, heavy with the knowledge that an entire way of life was about to vanish into the history books. Veteran cowboys who'd spent their lives stoic as stone monuments openly wept around the chuck wagon, knowing that barbed wire and railroads had finally corralled the limitless freedom they'd ridden for decades. Charles Goodnight himself, now a millionaire rancher whose innovations had helped build an empire, joined this final journey like a general witnessing the end of a war he'd helped win. His original chuck wagon, the one that had started it all back in 1866, had been restored and was rolling one last time. 27 years had passed since that first experimental trip, and Goodnight rode alongside his creation like a father watching his child graduate, proud but heartbroken. The emotional weight of that final drive was almost unbearable. Cowboys shared stories around the chuck wagon that had been passed down through generations of trail hands, tales of stampedes survived, rivers crossed, and Indians faced. They spoke of cooks who'd become legends and meals that had saved lives. They remembered the men who'd died along the trails, buried in unmarked graves scattered across 1,000 miles of prairie. At every stop, word spread that this was the end. Former cowboys, now settled into ranch work or town jobs, rode out to witness history's conclusion. Some traveled hundreds of miles just to share one last meal around a chuck wagon fire, to hear the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling, to smell the sourdough biscuits that had sustained them through years of wandering. The farewell at the Dodge City stockyards was a scene that would have broken Mark Twain's heart. 3 generations of cowboys gathered as the last trail cook, a man called Sunset Williams who'd been feeding cowboys since 1871, served his final meal. When the last plate was cleaned and the last cup of coffee drained, Williams stood before the assembled crowd and ceremonially broke his sourdough crock against a wagon wheel. "The free range is officially closed," he declared, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "May God have mercy on what comes next." But here's the thing about truly revolutionary ideas. They don't die when their original purpose ends. They evolve, adapt, and find new ways to change the world. The chuck wagon's influence was about to spread like ripples on still water, transforming American society in ways Charles Goodnight never could have imagined when he bolted that first box to a Studebaker wagon. Fred Harvey, a Kansas entrepreneur who'd been watching the railroad expansion with the eye of a man who understood that moving people would create moving appetites, adopted chuck wagon hospitality principles to create America's first restaurant chain. The Harvey houses sprouted along railroad lines like mechanical flowers, serving 50,000 meals daily to passengers who demanded the same quality and reliability that chuck wagons had provided to cowboys. Harvey's waitresses, known as Harvey Girls, were trained in the same principles of organization, cleanliness, and customer service that had made chuck wagon cooks legendary. Henry Ford, that mechanical genius from Michigan, sent representatives to study chuck wagon efficiency when he was designing assembly line cafeterias for his factories. He understood that well-fed workers were productive workers, and the chuck wagon system of organization, preparation, and service became the template for feeding thousands of factory workers daily. Ford credited chuck wagon principles with helping him reduce worker turnover and increase productivity at his Highland Park plant. During the Spanish-American War, the United States Army officially adopted chuck wagon principles for field kitchens. Teddy Roosevelt himself, leading his Rough Riders through Cuban jungles, praised the system that kept his volunteers combat-ready, while other units suffered from malnutrition and disease. The chuck wagon's DNA was spreading through American military logistics, where it would prove invaluable in 2 world wars. The 20th century saw chuck wagon innovations everywhere, though most people didn't recognize their heritage. The lunch wagons that fed construction workers building American skyscrapers were direct descendants of Goodnight's mobile kitchen. The Red Cross disaster relief kitchens that appeared at every flood, fire, and earthquake were organized according to chuck wagon principles that prioritized efficiency, sanitation, and morale. During the Great Depression, government-funded soup kitchens adopted chuck wagon systems to feed millions of unemployed Americans. The Civilian Conservation Corps used mobile kitchens based on chuck wagon designs to feed young men building national parks and roads. The Works Progress Administration employed former chuck wagon cooks to design feeding systems for massive public works projects. World War II saw the ultimate evolution of chuck wagon principles as military field kitchens fed millions of soldiers across multiple continents. The famous mess kit, carried by every American soldier, was a direct descendant of the individual eating gear developed for cattle drives. The mobile kitchen units that followed advancing armies operated according to organizational principles first established around campfires on the Texas plains. Hollywood discovered the chuck wagon in the 1930s and immediately understood its symbolic power. Every Western film worth watching featured a chuck wagon scene, making it an eternal symbol of American resilience and hospitality. Movies like Red River and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance elevated the chuck wagon to mythical status, ensuring that generations of Americans would understand its cultural significance even if they'd never seen a real cow. By the 1950s, actual historic chuck wagons were commanding enormous prices at auctions, recognized as artifacts of American expansion as important as covered wagons or steam locomotives. Collectors paid tens of thousands of dollars for authentic Studebaker wagons with original chuck boxes, treating them like religious relics from a vanished age. The 21st century brought the most surprising evolution of all: food trucks. These modern mobile kitchens generate over $2 billion annually in American cities, serving everything from Korean tacos to gourmet grilled cheese. The organizational principles, the emphasis on speed and efficiency, the importance of location and timing, all direct descendants of innovations first developed by Charles Goodnight and perfected by generations of chuck wagon cooks. Tech companies like Google and Facebook spend millions recreating the chuck wagon's community-building magic in corporate cafeterias, understanding that shared meals create shared purpose. They hire anthropologists to study how food brings people together, unknowingly rediscovering principles that cowboys figured out around campfires more than a century ago. And, in a final, beautiful irony, actual chuck wagons are experiencing a renaissance. State fairs, rodeos, and Western heritage festivals feature authentic chuck wagon competitions, where modern cooks prepare traditional meals using original techniques. These events draw hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, proving that the hunger for authentic community experience that the chuck wagon satisfied still burns in the American soul. Charles Goodnight died in 1929 at the age of 93, long enough to see automobiles replace horses and cities swallow the open range. But his simple insight, that shared food creates shared purpose, that good meals make good men, that mobile civilization requires mobile kitchens, proved as enduring as the stars that guided those first cattle drives. The chuck wagon had fed a nation's expansion, created American cuisine, established principles of mobile hospitality that span continents, and demonstrated that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from solving the most basic human needs. From a wooden box bolted to a farm wagon to a multi-billion-dollar food industry, the line runs straight and true. Every time you buy lunch from a food truck, eat in a corporate cafeteria, or share a meal around a campfire, you're participating in a tradition that began when Charles Goodnight realized that hungry men couldn't build an empire. The chuck wagon's greatest achievement wasn't just feeding cowboys. It was proving that civilization isn't a place you find. It's something you carry with you, one meal at a time. The trails may be closed, but the tradition rolls on.